they used to go mostly to India 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Today they're going to different places. They're going to Japan, to China, to the US, to Australia, etc. That's normal. We live in a more globalized world. It's good to have different options. But still, I think that we need to correct that second period of disconnectivity, fragmentation, and partition, which has divided us, which has, I think, led to divergences between these countries. So let's start with the first period, maybe the one I'm on the weakest on, but to give you a sense at least of where we're coming from. One thing you will learn a lot from books, which I profess to be wrong and I want to correct, and we read far too much Western historiography still. You read history today at universities in South Asia. I'm not sure about your department, but if you see most texts are based on the great canons from Western historians. And the history, even when it's pro-West or anti-West, doesn't matter, but it's still mostly Western names that dominate and the narratives about history. And one thing you keep reading is that colonialism and the era of imperialism between the 16th century and the 20th century brought people together, created open spaces, created circulation of goods, of ideas, of students, in this imperial place. And the British Empire, of course, was the largest of such empires. Again, I come from Portugal. Portugal was the first of these empires when it reached Calicut in 1498 in India and started controlling different territories across Asia. There was a time in which a Malabar trader from Kerala would speak in Portuguese with a Japanese trader. They would speak to Portuguese with each other. A Sri Lankan trader would speak in Portuguese and write agreements in Portuguese with a Malaysian trader. That was the lingua franca, that was the language that was used. The Portuguese currency at that point was used for trading within Asia. That was the era of empires, and it's true that in some way, therefore, these empires facilitated and led an area of globalized interdependence post-16th century, right? There were flows of people, there was a logic of trade, whether it was cotton, whether it was tea, whether it was opium, right? That was the political economy, the global political economy that was created post-16th century here in Asia. But that does assume that there was no flow, no connection pre-colonialism. And that's the first point I want to make, and I want to invite you to correct, to think about, is that these regions had certainly an existence and a history before the era of imperialism. And they were deeply connected to each other. Deeply connected to ties of migration, language, religion, and commerce and trade that were enhanced, accelerated in some ways through the area of imperialism and colonialism, but they were not invented through that. Yeah? So there's a history that remains to be revised, fleshed out, recovered. Because obviously it did not suit Portuguese or British or Dutch colonialists to say, you all together before us. It of course benefited, and that's the way the British looked at this, is that we brought this continent together. We gave you civilizational ties now, we brought different civilizations together, right? But it's incumbent on you, on us as scholars, to revive, rethink, recover the pre-colonial history of connectivity, of linkages that spanned thousands of years, that linked this Bay of Bengal and larger Asia. That is also one between India and China, between India and Southeast Asia, between Sri Lanka and the Indian Ocean region states, between Sri Lanka and Malaysia, between Sri Lanka and Indonesia, between Sri Lanka and China, when Zheng He came here, for example, on his maritime routes. But there's a history there of flows, of linkages that must be studied, must be celebrated, must be invested in also culturally. So that's the point number one, that we had that history, not only during the colonial period, but throughout the colonial period, up to the end of the colonial period. Moment number two, what has happened? Divergence, division, partitions. This happens as colonialism receded, Britain left. Let's not forget that Sri Lanka is the oldest Asian democracy. You are the oldest Asian democracy. This was the first place from which the British technically seceded, and you had the first formal elections, free elections in the continent of Asia. And as that withdrawal happened, those linkages collapsed. Why? Because modern states emerged, number one. Political borders were reinstituted, or were instituted, not reinstituted, were instituted, were implemented, right? Passports, few people had passports until the early 20th century in this region. It's only post-1950s that people get passports, that there are border controls, right? That you cannot freely take a ship from Sri Lanka to South India. That you have to get some check, some clearance, someone is controlling you, right? So as empire disappears, and Britain, for example, in this last case in South Asia and most of Asia, kept this together or allowed mostly free mobility, all of that disappeared very quickly, right? There were new states. In South Asia, we saw one violent partition between India and the two parts of Pakistan, west and east, in 1947, and then a 1971 war that India fought to support the liberation of Bangladesh. But there was a succession of partitions, of borders. People, for example, in the region northeast India could freely move. There were no borders between what's called today Bangladesh or was East Pakistan and the states of Assam, West Bengal, Tripura. There were people living in Sikkim and in Ladakh that freely entered Tibet and the rest of China, that traded, had lived for thousands of years across those political economies, trading cattle, yaks, milk. There were merchant routes. It was an open space for hundreds and thousands of years, right? Not because of colonialism again, but also through colonialism. And those borders were instituted, and they disrupted those linkages. People could suddenly no longer trade. There was someone there from the military or the police controlling, saying, no, that is Pakistan, this is India. That is Sri Lanka, Ceylon, this is India. That's Myanmar, Burma, this is India, right? So these modern states came into existence because that was the era of modern states in the 20th century. But it interrupted these flows, right? For example, students from Burma used to come in the hundreds to study at the University of Calcutta up to 1950s and 60s. Hundreds of top students. You had ministers, prime ministers in Burma that had studied in India. Same for Ceylon. Same for Nepal, right? For many of these countries, Afghanistan, they had all been linked to India, part of this larger space, India, British India if you want, not Republic of India, but they were linked. There were free routes of commerce, right? With Tibet, with Afghanistan. There were missions in the larger space, in Suez Canal, in Tibet, in Xinjiang, that were trading missions for British India, right? And I think that's got, what I want to make clear is that got disrupted with those borders, right? And when you disrupt that, you introvert yourself. For example, the economic models that many of these countries in South Asia used. All the South Asian countries post-1947 chose socialist, protectionist, introvert economic models, autarkic models, where you did not focus on trading freely, where you did not focus on investing freely in and out. The rest of the world was integrating. 1950s, 60s, 70s, all other countries and regions of the world were coming together. The European Union is born in 1957 with the Schuman Declaration, by trading coal and steel. So today you can travel across 10 different states in Europe without showing once your passport, right? You can travel from Lisbon to Lithuania without showing once the passport. There's no controls. I can't even see where the border is anymore. And I remember when I was a kid, I would take these and there were police there, they would control you, whether you were smuggling, if you have the right visa. Today you don't even know where the border is. There were tanks, there were militaries, there was barbed wire, Germany was divided in east and west. Today the European Union is one general big economic polity. Southeast Asia came together under ASEAN, the Southeast Asian Association of Nations. Mercosur in South America came together with trade agreements. Parts of Africa came together. East Asia came together. China, Japan, and the East Asian tiger economies came together. But in South Asia, post-40s, it's exactly the opposite. The world was entering an area of regionalism, coming together. South Asia was diverging with each other and from the rest of the world. There was no trade between India and Sri Lanka, it decreased. There were no flows. Burmese students stopped coming to Indian universities. Sri Lankans stopped coming to India. Indians went less to the neighboring countries, right? Because you didn't have economic openness, there was no incentives, there was no focus on this, there was economic stagnation, introversion, etc. Also geostrategic considerations, right? India as the predominant power insulated this region from the great power politics of US, Soviet Union, and the different blocs. This was a non-aligned bloc, right, that kept to itself. Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Burma, these are all countries that were non-aligned, independent in their alignments. They were not close to the Western camp, nor were they close to the Soviet camp. Partially here and there they would be close, but they were kept to itself. So all of this led to insulation, stagnation, and divergence at all different levels. And it could go on. In our papers, we measure those indicators. Tourism, students, trade, transportation networks, everything collapsed. We did a study on airplane connectivity. Can you believe that in the 1950s and 60s, it was easier to fly from Sri Lanka to South India than today? I just read the news this morning that the ferry is going to be reestablished between South India and Jaffna, which ran until 87. I know people that took a train from Kolkata to, you could go to Colombo station and buy a train ticket to Kolkata. Single train ticket, and not train the wagon once. You would take the multimodal connectivity of the ferry, the train would go on the ferry I'm forgetting the name, Rameshwaram, right, on the Indian side. Here it is, and on this side it's Muna. No? Mana, yeah. So you could take the train, you could take a single ticket. That is connectivity. That means you could go to sleep in Colombo night and late next morning maybe be in Kolkata, or late next evening be in Kolkata in the same train. Right? But flight connectivity, you could take flights from Jaffna to Trichy. You could fly from Sitwa in northern Myanmar to Colombo. You could fly from Sitwa to Kolkata. You could fly from smaller cities in East Pakistan to India. So it's amazing. 60 years later, it's actually more difficult to fly from within each other than it was in the 50s and 60s. Just to give you an idea of how that divergence has happened, has left us in a place that is actually in absolute ways worse today than it was 60, 70 years ago. Right? Because that's a history of divergence. And then point 3, the era of reconnection that we are living now. That's why we're doing the study. When we tell people this data that we're showing, that look, it was easier, this region was more integrated, it was more close to each other 60 years ago than it's today, it's shocking. People react and say, wow, how is this possible? But that's the truth. There's a lot of facts that tell you whether you look at any of these indicators. And now, for many reasons, we are reconnecting this region. Yeah? For many reasons, some of which economic. In the 1950s, you took protectionist economic policies. After the 1990s, all countries opened up their economies. Sri Lanka actually was ahead of India. Sri Lanka experimented with reforms from the early 80s. But all these countries in succession opened up their economies. And vice versa, all these countries also started looking at other opportunities. Other countries, other partners. So Sri Lanka developed its relations with European countries, with the US, with China, with Japan, with Southeast Asia, etc. So that openness is now reconnecting the region slowly. But it's far too little and far too slow. Yeah? Today, we finally have this. I was mentioning the ferry boat today being restarted. The first flight in Jaffna, I think, landed 1 or 2 years ago, then was stopped. I hope it started again. So now finally you can fly to Jaffna directly from India, for example, to give you an example. So connectivity is slowly restarting. Trade is picking up. Investments are picking up. Slowly Sri Lankan students are going again to South India to study in prominent institutions, in medical institutions, engineering institutions. And there is a slow reconnectivity that we are observing in this region. But it's far too slow, and it's incumbent on all of you, all of us, to accelerate that reintegration, accelerate that connectivity, accelerate in the Bay of Bengal, in South Asia, but also the Bay of Bengal region. Why I said Bay of Bengal today in particular is because it's not only about South Asia. South Asia is very limited, sort of India at the heart, right, and some smaller countries around. But if you look at the Bay of Bengal, you include Myanmar, a very important country, going through a lot of conflict and problems, but it's a future for Asia is being played out in many ways of what's happening in Myanmar. Thailand, a middle-income economy full of opportunities that is growing. Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, a maritime neighbor of India. We forget that. India is a maritime neighbor of India. I'm not sure of Sri Lanka, but of India. because of the Andaman Nicobar Islands. So India is a Southeast Asian country in many ways. So the Bay of Bengal allows you for a much larger perspective where India and Sri Lanka can jointly work to accelerate this connectivity. So again, more people-to-people linkages, learning from your history. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. That's why I started with that first point. There were flows and connectivities and civilizational links that have been dormant, that we need to study, that we need to recover. You telling me a fabulous story this morning about that mango tree, for example. Maybe you can mention it after. But it's little stories that we need to understand. And last point I'll leave you with, just as a caution, is that see, connectivity, coming together, does not mean that everything will be wonderful. We will live in an era of peace. As I was mentioning in the podcast, sometimes you know that conflicts within a family, inside a family, are worse than conflicts between different families, right? Sometimes when you are very close to each other, there's friction, there's tension, there's closeness. You always want to look the other side. The grass always looks greener on the other side, far away. You know, other families look so amazing, so good, they're much better than us, and we want to escape. That's fine. But there will be ways in which you will have to also manage connectivity, yeah? In which you will have to also develop good relations with India, with Bangladesh, with Myanmar, with Thailand. It's very important for you to not just say, let's come together, but also find good ways. And there, it's more important for these ties to be developed at the people-to-people level than at the government-to-government level. I'm suspicious. I always look at the government. My area is always hanging out with ambassadors, ministers, government, foreign policy, etc. But see, governments come and go, political leaders come and go, there's sometimes friction, tensions, and that's okay, it will happen. There will be moments of economic clashes, geopolitical problems, tensions. But people-to-people ties act as an insurance. They mitigate those volatility, those conflicts, right? As long as there's people-to-people connectivity, there's understanding, often in moments of tensions between countries, it is the people, civil society actors, business actors, cultural stakeholders and policies that know each other, that know the sensitivity, that know how the other country thinks about you, that take the relationship forward and insulate it, or at least reduce the problems that can happen and will happen eventually. So I'll end at that and look forward to your questions and an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for those fruitful words. And now the floor is open for questions. Yes, Sanidhya?
Yes, I hope this question does not come off as hostile, but we see that there have been growing tension, an eternal tension between India and Pakistan since the division during the leaving of British. And are there any procedures set in place where India and Pakistan are trying to reconcile, or will we ever see proper peace within the two countries? Because in recent times we see that India has decided to boycott the Asian Cup that was proposed to be held in Pakistan. So we see tensions that have been eternal since the division. So are there any proceedings in place for reconciliation between the two countries?
No hostile questions. That's a wonderful thing about universities. They're always free, and you should be free thinkers and ask all the questions you want. That's the beauty of this space that Kelaniya gives you, right? Freedom of thought and asking questions. See, let me try to answer, though I'm a guest in your country, but from your perspective. Don't bank on India and Pakistan getting a wonderful relation going, whether it's tomorrow, 10 years from now, right? You don't want to outsource your possibilities to a possible reconciliation, more or less, etc. Right? That's a relationship. It's not it's difficult. It has had ups. It has had downs. India-Pakistan relations. So I would not tie the future of Sri Lanka's regionalism and cooperation to the contingents, the condition that India and Pakistan must do well. And I hear that a lot in Sri Lanka, unfortunately. That, oh, if only India and Pakistan did well, then we could cooperate. No. There's a world of regional possibilities of connectivity that do not depend on India and Pakistan for you. That's why I focused, again, it's good you asked the question, because it's another reason why I focus on the Bay of Bengal and not South Asia. Right? The Bay of Bengal is towards the east. It's your natural space, more than even India's, right? That's where you are. You're looking towards the east, you're on the eastern coast, on the eastern side of the Indian Ocean, right? So there are, for example, many other initiatives that are happening in this region. They don't need to include India and Pakistan, right? But India for sure. BIMSTEC, for example, the regional organization that I will invite you to study and focus much more on than the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation that is, because of the issue, sometimes not producing a lot of results. But BIMSTEC has a people-to-people cultural pillar of cooperation. BIMSTEC has a connectivity pillar. The connectivity pillar is led by the Thai government, right? So it includes those countries towards the east. And it allows you to build what I said and asked you all to do, build connectivity, deepen linkages in this region beyond that issue on the western front. But yeah, if you want now the questions, I'm not very hopeful of any resolution soon. I mean, you must have seen the sad news of what's happening in Pakistan these days. So until those fires are doused, I don't think there'll be a lot of developments in India-Pakistan relations.
The floor is still open for more questions. Anyone?
Doctor, I also have a question. What you stressed that out is similar with China and also parallel China, I think. And you both are territorial land and Sri Lanka is island, if I'm correct. What happens if China says the same thing like India? That's the question is.
So number one, China is saying the same things as India, right? It's also saying we have old civilizational linkages with you. There's an era of Asian connectivity. We must come together, etc. Right? So that's number one. All countries have their cultural narratives in cultural diplomacy, right? And that's normal. They're different based on different things. Often they often reflect their internal perceptions and values. So number one, China is doing same things, not saying similar things, and Sri Lanka in particular, on Buddhism, for example, right? It's pushing very strongly. But we live now in an era, you all in particular. I still come in an era where I didn't have internet. I had to fax letters to my grandmother if I wanted to say hello, or mail. Forget faxing, mailing, right? A letter, post a letter. But you all probably are of the generation that is saying geography doesn't matter much. I can chat with someone in Japan, I can have a video conference. It's amazing what has happened in the world in the last 20 years in terms of technology and the shrinking of space, right? Today you can communicate freely, etc. And geography doesn't matter. Except that geography will always continue to matter a lot. And you mentioned that India is next door. It's the main neighbor of Sri Lanka. Right? It will be there. Whatever it is there. You cannot wish it away. You can say that we have an equal relationship with all countries matter the same. That's fine. But believe me, I've worked and read speeches, hundreds of speeches of Sri Lankan officials that are public. But in private, all Sri Lankan officials always say, whatever their view is, that India is always first on our mind. It is next door for many reasons. History, culture, politics, economics, etc. Right? So there will be ways in which geography will affect and shape you, whether you like it or not. And there is a world which will transcend this era of we're all one world, we're all connected to each other. No. Right? I mean, you saw the pandemic. We talked about a globalized world, but the pandemic drove home the point that proximity still matters. I mean, India had to decide within hours, should it close its border with Nepal or not? Now, it's not easy to close the border with Nepal. There are villages in which the border crosses the village. No one knows where the border is. There are families that have lived across that border, right? So geography hits you in the face in many ways that are bad, but also very good, right? If you want to develop your economy, you need to look at South India today. Why is Apple investing in South India, right? So there are political, economic, and geographic issues that will continue to shape things. And there's space also for many other countries beyond geography. I mean, Europe today, you'd be surprised, is one of the main investors in Asia. Europe is far away, but it's one of the main investors in Asia, including in Sri Lanka. So there are many ways in which countries can matter, but geography will always matter in very concrete ways. Sorry.
Dr. Smith, so I'm going to ask you a follow-up question that is regarding the neighborhood fact that you said that India is our neighbor, so we have to focus on it. Although Sri Lanka is India's neighbor, they are not giving much focus to Sri Lanka. We can say that by using the fact that India at the moment is following a look-east foreign policy, so they are focusing much on the Southeast Asian nations. So now, much like Indonesia's role in regional integration through organizations such as ASEAN, couldn't you say that India has a much bigger role to play in regional integration by using organizations such as SAARC, which is at the moment dormant?
Good, great question. The answer is yes. India should do much more. I mean, and you know why that's an interesting question you ask? If you'd asked this question 20 years ago, or in Sri Lanka, 30 years ago, 40 or 50 years ago, the question would be India's doing too much. We don't want as much India. This was the narrative in many of these neighboring countries, in Nepal, and I've studied these countries for decades. I read their even reports, how the government was thinking without saying it in public, right? So I know how Sri Lankan prime ministers, presidents have thought about India. I've looked at the archives, declassified documents. I've interviewed hundreds of people in this country who told me very privately and sincerely what they thought. But that was the idea. Please, India, stay away. We don't want more of you. We feel too close to you. You know, even in the family, right? Proximity, sometimes you don't want your aunt, your uncle too close, right? They're very close, or in this case, any relative, right? In fact, I remember a time when which Indian leaders would say that we're the big brother, right? Which is not very well received often in Sri Lanka. We don't want a big brother, right? We're no one would. I have a big sister, and I'm very proud of her, but bigger is always a little bit of a shadow, right? So I think that's number one. Today, what you're asking me is the question that is being asked. In Bangladesh, people are telling me, why is India not doing more for us? We want more investment. We want more trade. We want more cultural connectivity. We want a bigger cultural center, more active cultural center. We want to have MOUs. We want to have exchanges, right? So that tells you what I was arguing, that there is an era of reconnectivity, that also the mindset has changed in these countries. They've seen opportunity in India, number one. So India absolutely is, for a country like India that often was, these are smaller countries, we can take them for granted, which is what you do with younger siblings, right? You take them for granted, you only call them when you need them, or something. But suddenly, there's a transactionalism. There's something they're asking you for. And when they ask you for something, you have to find ways to deliver. You cannot just deny or sit on it and forget. And worse, there are now other people that are offering more to Sri Lanka, right? So I think that is now certainly a stress. And that's a good stress. It's a wonderful challenge that the Indian government has, and Indian civil society, Indian business, that is saying we must do more for neighborhood first. And they are doing more. Let me give you one example of this will be quite striking for the studies of students of international relations here. Who knows prior Prime Minister Modi's visit in 2015, who was the previous Prime Minister that visited Sri Lanka? 2015 before. Anyone knows? It's a 3 hours flight, 3.5 hours flight from Delhi to Colombo. Not Vajpayee. That would have been 2000s. No one knows? I mean, you have to see, this is what you have to know. You have to know the history of your neighbor and your bilateral relations. Not Manmohan Singh. Not 20 years, not 30 years.
Manmohan, now. discussed by
Manmohan Singh never came for a bilateral
no,
visit.
I think Modi.
Yeah, Modi, but before Modi 2015, 1987. Rajiv Gandhi, 1987, on August 1st. And you know for what visit, right? Why did he come? Please. I mean, if you don't know your history, you have to know. Why did he come? Please, hands in the air. Why did he come in 1987, August? And for how long? Less than 24 hours. And he was attacked by one of your Marine officers. He came for the IPKF, for the Indian Military Peacekeeping Force, right? To sign the agreement with President Jayavarman in August. So that was not the best visit. Let's put it like that, okay? That was not the best visit. It was a very short, very quick visit. So when was the last good visit of a Prime Minister of India who took a 3.5 hours flight for a bilateral state visit to Sri Lanka? 1979, Morarji Desai. 78 or 79? I'm not sure. 78 or 79? What is it? Huh? 78. 78. So, no visit in 1980s. No visit, Rajiv Gandhi, that little visit. 90s, 2000s, 2015. How do you explain that the Prime Minister had not come? How many times has Prime Minister Modi come now? 4? 3? 3 times. 3 times in 7 years. So this is just one example I was giving you. Is India doing, it's doing more than ever, but it's still too little and still too slow. It will do more. But this tells you about the neglect and also of how now there's a focus on Sri Lanka to do much more. But again, don't forget, everyone is asking this from India. You're not the only ones. Thailand is asking more from India, right? Japan is asking from India. Africa is asking more from India. More cultural relations, more economic investments, more trade, etc. So it's also incumbent on you, and this is a mindset change that also has to happen in Sri Lanka. You cannot wait for India. When I'm telling you to study Hindi, you have to take proactive measures to look at the world 20, 30 years from now and think, how do you want to make best benefit on what's going to happen next door in your geography, right? How do you want to see beneficial connectivity between India and Sri Lanka, right? Business, transportation, academic exchanges, etc. We need to know much more about each other and restore that era of connectivity.
2 more questions. Yes, and now the floor is closed for questions. And thanks a lot, sir. I believe it was quite a fruitful session. And now I would like to call up on stage.
Can I ask just, can you tell the Mango Street story? Very cool.
Now I would like to call up on stage Professor Ankuran Datta, the Director and the First Secretary of the Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center. The floor is yours.
Namaskar, everyone. Very good morning to all of you. So I'm not going to take much of your time. It is very interesting discussion, really. The last 1 hour, so we listened to Dr. Constantino Javier, and who gave a very insightful information about India-Sri Lanka relationship from the perspective of Bay of Bengal. At the very beginning, I would like to thank Professor Chaminda Abhay-Singh, who is the head of the Department of the International Studies of the University of Kelania, for accepting this invitation, and the coordinator of all the events today, Professor K.V. Jayawardena, head of the Department of Sanskrit, and all the esteemed faculty members of the International Studies Department, and all the students. In the great epic Mahabharata, there is a very interesting quote: Sarvasya Jiva Lokasya Rajadharma Parayana. That every person should be loyal to the Rajadharma. The relationship, the international relationship, also comes from that particular statement, and later on that in our all the relationships with India and Sri Lanka, it is millennium old, and so we have lots of different kinds of relationships in the last thousands and thousands of years. If you can say that whatever the visit of the Lord Buddha, or later on, like when Mahinda Thero came here with a very interesting cultural relationship with Buddhism. Then after that, Sanghamita Theri, when she brought the Mahabodhi sapling, and also Prince Danta and Princess Hemamala, when they brought to Sri Lanka. It is so interesting today for me, on behalf of Swami Vivekananda Culture Center of the High Commission of India. We started with a program in the morning. It is on yoga, and I was discussing there that yoga is nothing but it is connectivity with your body, breath, and mind. This session is on the connectivity between two countries. The next program is on Rabindranath Tagore, Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore, who is the first Nobel laureate of Asia, who used to say that the concept of a nation should be boundaryless. It is beyond the boundary. So there are connectivity in all these three programs too. He said that my nation is ideal. It is without any boundary. And our entire, that question you asked, that our entire relationship and international relationship is also based on that particular principle, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The whole world is our own family. And in this government, we have always, the priority is the neighborhood first, is a policy in the foreign, in the international relations of India. I was discussing with him that with the connection, all this connectivity, and so interestingly, I'm a professor of communication, and so I always look where is there is any option for communication or the connection. And see, with this university as well, I was explaining to him, it is, I hope that all of you are aware that it was originally started from Vidyalankara Pirivena, and I hope you visited also Vidyalankara Pirivena, and in front of a very beautifully designed architectural building, there is a mango tree. You know that mango tree was planted by whom? In 1944, the then Vice Chancellor of Banaras Hindu University, who was later the President of India, Dr. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan. You know, on the day of your establishment of your university, who was the chief guest? The first President of India, Dr. Rajendra Prasad. See the relationship which not only between the countries but between the universities and the people of the country. And so we built that relationship which always, and I am not going to take much of your time because another program will start at 11:30 and Dr. Javier has to leave to the airport on time. Otherwise I have to host him again for another couple of days time. And so thank you so much. He is a ICCR Distinguished Alumni Awardee. That is a very, very prestigious award that we provide to all the alumni. And in this regard, I would like to request that India provides nearly 200 full everything with all the costs scholarships to the Sri Lankan students. So we always offer nearly 200 scholarships under the different schemes of Indian Council for Cultural Relations, and so you can avail all these scholarships, and these are basically announced by the Ministry of Education of the Government of Sri Lanka. This time it is already over, but next time who are interested, definitely they can go, and like Dr. Javier, you can also study in Jawaharlal Nehru University in the International Relations Department to know more about the India-Sri Lanka relationship, and or otherwise like Professor Jayavardhana at Banaras Hindu Universities. We have 1,200 universities in India with more than 50,000 colleges in the country, and so anywhere you can just go. And thank you so much for giving me this opportunity as well, and for hosting this particular event. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Now I would like to call Dr. Charminder Abesingha on stage to deliver a token of appreciation to Dr. Constantino Xavier on behalf of the International Studies Students Association. Thank you, sir. Now, I would like to call Dr. Ankurnath Datta on behalf of the Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center of the Indian High Commission to deliver a certain token of appreciations.
First, I would like to, with this small token of appreciation to the head of the Department of the International Studies. Second one is to our speaker, our dear friend, Dr. Xavier. And third one is to Professor K.V. Jayavardhana, who has been continuously working on all these events.
Thank you, sir. Now we've actually come to the end of the program, but before we wrap it up, I believe certain people should be given due recognition for organizing this splendid event. A very big thank you for Dr. Constantino Xavier, not only for conducting the lecture, but also taking part in our podcast. It was a really good opportunity for all of us. Your knowledge, you actually shared your knowledge with us, and we had a really, really good time. A very special thank you to Dr. Ankurnath Datta. Thank you, sir, for giving us this opportunity in organizing this with us, and if not for you all, it wouldn't have been a success. A special thanks to Professor K.B. Jayavardhana as well, because if not for him, this initiative or this entire event wouldn't have been held. Thank you, sir, for your constant work. And a very, very special thank you for our head of the department, Dr. Charminda Abhay-Singha. He has been the pillar of strength throughout behind this establishment, and without you, sir, all these events would just be a dream for all of us. And also the ones who are behind the stage, the lecturers, the student union, and also the non-academic staff. Nothing would have been a success. And I believe all of y'all had a really, really good day, and all of y'all were able to gain a tremendous knowledge out of this guest lecture. Thank you. Now, to formally conclude the event, I would like to request all of you to rise for the national anthems.
Namo उत्कलगङ्गा विन्ध्य हिमाचल यमुना गङ्गा उच्चल जलधितरङ्गा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तव जय गाथा